This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. Sandy Johnson, K-State Beef Reproduction Specialist, kicks off today's show with reminders for cattle producers when it comes to caring for cattle in their third trimester and how to give the cow and calf the best circumstances. Keeping the show rolling is part of a Bovine Science episode from the Beef Cattle Institute with Brad White and Bob Larson as they talk about an issue a rancher was having with his calves after bringing them together for weaning. K-State dairy specialist Mike Brouk ends the show discussing how extreme cold can cause teat damage and what producers can do to protect the herd. That and more is coming up ahead. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we start our show talking about things related to breeding cattle and calving with K-State Beef Reproduction Specialist Sandy Johnson. Sandy, thanks for joining us today.
Glad to be here.
Sandy, first focusing on spring calving cattle herds, and what is something that maybe they should be doing this time of year?
Yeah, this is a busy time of year. You know, obviously we're harvesting and cattle they're not off summer pasture. They probably will be soon, moving the crop residues. So we're thinking about making those changes, but depending on the herd, that schedule might be slightly different. But what we do know, and it's close to an average spring calving date that I can find, is about March 1. Which means that at the end of November, those cows are starting into that third trimester when that rapid fetal growth starts to occur. And so it provides an opportunity for us, if we have thin cows, the sooner we take action to try and improve their condition before calving, the better off we're going to be. And weather has been fairly mild, but we don't expect that to change. And so we think about this cow with this rapidly growing fetus, as from this point forward, it's just going to be, we call it a logarithmic increased rate of growth. So the calf needs more and more when the weather gets colder and colder. And if we have a thin cow, then that's just another energy hit for her. So this is our opportunity to put a little more condition on her before she calves. And again, often we're busy doing other things, but we can take advantage of that opportunity. And often it doesn't take much if we give ourselves more time.
What body condition score would you like them to be at?
Yeah, so generally we like to see cows in a body condition score of 5 or greater, and first calf heifers closer to 6. Now, there probably are some herds that maintain on somewhat less than that year-round in a more extensive environment that are maybe adapted to that. But, those are our general recommendations when we think of the broad population of cows in the area. And so the challenge is once she calves, our opportunity to put more condition on is very difficult unless we have a lot of corn and silage that we're going to shovel to her, because first she's going to produce more milk before she even thinks about putting on more condition and getting herself ready to cycle again. So now is the time to take action if you have some thin cows.
What are your tips or recommendations for cattle producers who are looking at their cattle and realizing their body condition scores aren't high enough?
Well, often this time of year, just a little bit of protein supplement might be enough for those cows to increase condition. It really depends on what their forage resources are. And the sooner we can get at that in relation to what those increasing nutrient requirements are, the less we can get away with, right? Because requirements are as low as they're going to be right now on this spring calving cow. And so a little bit now goes a long ways to getting her to that better body condition, and if indeed she does need to do that. Another way to think about it, this calf and fluids are going to weigh maybe 150 pounds. And so she needs to gain at least that much before calving, or she's losing condition. All right. And so if she's thin on top of that, all right, then maybe she needs a We often think of a body condition score as being worth 70 to 80 pounds of body weight, depending on frame. And it's probably a little bit more than that on some of these large frame cows. So then you think, okay, she's got to gain 150 pounds for that calf. And she's down one body condition score. That's another 100 pounds, say, just roughly. So there's 250 pounds she needs to gain. How many days you got to do it, until she calves. You start looking at that average daily gain. Well, then it's pretty high. And what we typically feed cows, we're trying to control those feed costs, don't have enough energy to make a huge amount of gain. A small amount of gain we can do, particularly if we have more days to do it.
We've focused towards wanting to add more condition on cattle, but do we ever have too much condition on cattle?
Yes, we certainly can. On both cows and bulls, excess condition can have negative impacts. Now, cows, we typically only see that maybe in some cows that have put into an embryo transfer situation where they're flushing them and they're not lactating for a long period of time, and it's really hard to, when they aren't lactating, you need to still keep them on a reasonable amount of, can't just take everything away because you still want them to reproduce. So it's a very fine balance there. And then we can get into some problems there. And we don't really understand probably the physiology of what the excess condition does, but, we do see those negative impacts. And so, moderation is always where we want to be. And of course, it costs money to put more condition on than what we need. So unless you're not concerned about your profitability of your cow herd, then, sure, you can feed them all you want and make them fatter. And I know there are people that like to see their cows in a certain condition, and it's perfectly fine as long as you're reaching your production goals and profitability goals. I have no argument that you're meeting your goals.
Sandy, we've discussed putting the appropriate amount of condition on an animal. So once they have calved, do you see that really impact what their milk supply is and their ability to then care for that calf with the appropriate condition?
Well, probably the biggest thing we might see in terms of subsequent lactation would be the quality of the colostrum. If we have thin cows, they tend to not produce as much, the same amount of immunity that's delivered in that colostrum, the immunoglobulins. And particularly that would be true with young cows. And so when we think about getting that calf off to a healthy start, that's part of the advantage of a cow in a good body condition is she produces higher quality colostrum. That sets that calf up for its lifetime health success. So, and particularly in a first calf heifer that's going to have less milk anyway, again, that's very important there to have her in good condition to, optimize her milk production and the calf health.
Have you ever seen cows that consistently seem to have trouble getting going again after birth?
Well, you can. Typically, it might be because something happened. There was calving difficulty, and maybe that causes them to be off feed for a longer period of time. But generally, if calving goes relatively normally, the foodstuffs are there, they're going to do all right. And, just the challenge is they will let you give them first to milk, and cyclicity and gain condition is long after they produce milk. And in general, our cow herd has such a high level of milk production. We probably don't feed cows enough to reach their milk production potential in our part of the country. I'm going to say Western Kansas. Our feed resources are not as lush, say, as they might be east of the Mississippi. So our weaning rates having not changed in many years, but we look at EPD changes over time, and the level of milk production that they project has certainly gone up. So we've changed the cow herd for potential for milk production, but not necessarily have we weaned more pounds of calf in the typical herd. So, we just shouldn't expect to be able to change that cow condition a lot after calving, but in particular, though, we want her on some kind of increasing energy balance to get her to cycle and allow us to get her rebred.
Is there anything besides the ration and diet for cattle that you want producers to keep in mind as we enter into winter?
Well, it's also time to be thinking about, what am I going to do in terms of any lice control? When's that going to come in? We certainly have some concern about parasites and more tick overwintering. So I think good conversation with your veterinarian on the appropriate products for when you're working cattle and, control those parasites that could be a problem over the winter. And that would be another part of my thinking. And then as well as looking forward, in my mind, the wintertime might be a good opportunity to visit with your veterinarian on, what's going to be our plan if we get some calf scours. What's, outline some of these protocols that we want to use. And maybe you sit down and look at your year-round plan over the winter months and say, okay, this is kind of when we want to do things. What products are, what are things changing in the animal health world that you think we should consider, for our herd, and have that discussion ahead of time as opposed to you're making some last minute call. Do you have this? I think I need to do this now. And, set out a plan that's more proactive than reactive.
Sandy, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
Glad to be here.
That was K-State Beef Reproduction Specialist, Sandy Johnson. As always, you can find more information from the K-State Beef Extension Team by going to ksubeef.org. We're cutting to a short break now, but stick around because we have more for you up ahead. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we continue our show with part of a Beef Cattle Institute's Bovine Science podcast episode. Today, we're joined by Brad White and Bob Larson.
You got some bloody diarrhea there, and I'm going to get your initial thoughts. What are some of the differentials that are popping through your mind on this one?
Well, I think this time of year and in this situation that you've described, coccidiosis would have to be really high on my list. I'm quite concerned that that's a possibility. Some of the things that can cause some bloody diarrhea, salmonella can do that. Basically, any intestinal disease that causes a lot of damage to the intestinal lining could cause some bloody diarrhea, but coccidiosis would rank pretty high as maybe where I'd start my investigation.
What about feeding? And in this case, they were feeding a corn gluten feed, soy hull mix with some free choice hay. Are you concerned about feeding, acidosis, some of the other things that would go along with that?
Well, based just on what the owner provided, you've got some those byproduct feeds, the corn gluten and the soy hulls, they're fibrous. They don't have much starch in them. And so that really reduces my risk for acidosis and those types of digestive tract upset. And so I'm not that worried about, acidosis really being a problem in these calves based on the diet that they're eating.
We talk about blood in the feces. It could either be frank blood, bright red, digested blood, kind of black. And what does that tell us, the difference between those?
So the frank blood, when you actually see red in the feces, that means that the damaged gut is fairly far back. It's closer to the anus. And so the blood hasn't been digested. So you think, large intestine, that type of thing. When you have digested blood, such as, abomasal ulcers or damage earlier in the digestive tract, there's time for that blood to be digested. And when digested, it comes out black, kind of that black tarry look to it. So when I see the red blood, well, I know that at least part of the damage is occurring in the back part of the large intestine.
Because it hasn't had time to digest the blood.
Yeah, exactly.
And have enough digestive tract to go through, which you would expect more with coccidiosis.
Exactly. That fits my coccidiosis problem.
So we've got acidosis lower on the list, but maybe still on there.
Yeah.
Coccidiosis, maybe salmonella. Anything else you put on your list here in this case?
Historically, we would see even BVD, and certainly in some of, a mucosal disease type of a thing, those would be on my list. Again, farther down because this is kind of seems to be a herd.
It'd be hard with 3 calves,
I agree.
And if the herd is
Absolutely.
off.
So you asked me if it's on my rule-out list. There are some that are pretty far down there that I don't really think that's what's going on, but other things that can cause some diarrhea.
Yeah.
There's a couple other things on the list, but not what this looks like to me.
Parasites?
Parasites, not with the frank blood that we're seeing. I really wouldn't put them up there on the list. And again, a really heavy parasite load can cause this, but again, geography, what part of the country are we talking about? So not so much.
So what do you do as far as diagnostics in this case?
You can do some fecal floats looking for the coccidia organisms. And there's several different coccidia organisms that infect cattle. And depending on the organism, they can kind of range from pretty pathogenic, causing quite a bit of tissue damage, to others that aren't nearly as damaging. It's kind of hard to tell the difference between the coccidia, and sometimes you need to bring in a parasitologist if you really want to know. The other thing I'll warn you a little bit, because of the way the disease process, and these coccidia organisms, they're protozoa, they'll actually invade into the cells lining the intestine and destroy them as they multiply, destroy the cells of the intestine as they multiply. Sometimes in some stages of the life cycle of the protozoa, they don't really show up in the feces. So you could have a lot of damage caused by the protozoa, the coccidia protozoa, and they don't show up in the fecal float. So if it looks like coccidiosis, and that's number one on my rule out list, but I don't detect any on a fecal float, that doesn't completely remove it from the still being my number one rule out. If I do find it, that kind of confirms what I thought, ignoring the rest of the things on my rule out list and focusing on control of the coccidia.
But wouldn't we expect to see some coccidia in almost any calf?
Good point. Yes, exactly. The coccidia organisms are common. They're actually common for any mammal. One of the interesting things about this organism is it does seem to be pretty species specific. In other words, the coccidia that infect and cause damage in cattle are different than the ones that cause problems to chickens or swine or different things like that. So they are pretty species specific, but they're very common. In fact, I would expect that most animals are infected, maybe all are infected. Finding them on a fecal float, it'd be a few. And so, again, the number that are there would be informative to me. But like I say, you got to be a little bit careful if it looks like a coccidiosis problem and I'm not finding large numbers of those organisms. That doesn't necessarily rule it out for me.
So if we go through in this case and they've got coccidia, and that seems to be our problem, whether we find it or not, that's what we've kind of backed into as our diagnosis. Where did they get it from?
Well, they had it themselves. It's really it's not that they got it from somebody else necessarily, although I don't want to say that too quickly, because if one of the reasons that we sometimes see outbreaks is cattle that are exposed to other cattle with another species that they haven't been exposed to before. But for the most part,
So in this case, he brought them from 4 different
They
farms.
could have had, even though he owns all the pastures, they could have different populations of coccidia in those different populations of cows and calves. And so the group brought it in with them. The cattle build some immunity, particularly adults. So young animals are more likely to be affected with coccidiosis. It takes some time. Protozoa are one of those things that, you can build some immunity, but not quickly. And I don't know if it's truly immunity or just resiliency or whatever that an adult animal develops. But they develop them to the coccidia that they've been exposed to before. And there are several species of coccidia that can infect cattle. And so we could have a mixing of coccidia species as we bring these cattle from 4 different places. And there are some nutritional challenges, because in this particular situation, when we got to talking, exactly what's going on, because they're weaning calves from multiple pastures, this doesn't happen in a short period of time. It takes a week or 2 to actually have that. So you think about the nutritional challenge. I'm trying to get these calves started, and I'm just adding new calves to a kind of a large pen. And so I've got some cattle that are well adapted and know where the water is and are hitting the bunk pretty good, and some that are just adding. So when I add more feed to handle the additional cattle, I've got some challenges there about keeping everybody on track nutritionally, and I'm mixing cattle from different sources, which probably means they could be bringing in different coccidia, and they may have developed some immunity or resistance to the coccidia from their pasture, but now they're being exposed to calves with a different strain.
Does the life cycle of the organism play a role in our timing here?
Yeah, it certainly does. In that, the protozoa, they go through multiple life stages, some of which are kind of where they multiply and damage the gut, others where they are basically growing and getting stronger and healthier, but they're not really multiplying and damaging the gut. So, yeah, at different stages of the life cycle. In fact, for the first 4 weeks or so, I'm not going to find the oocytes in the feces, but they could start making some damage even before I detect oocytes in the feces.
So in this case, it came from the animal, came in, they shed, and it's fecal-oral is how it's transmitted, right?
Yes.
So if they're feeding in that pen, they go through. But here, they were feeding free choice hay and a ration that had an ionophore in it. So shouldn't the ionophore help control?
Yeah. So now we're getting into some of our controls and prevention. So ionophores, like Rumensin or Bovitec, they do provide some control, but think of them as controlling the multiplication so that they're not really able to get to really high levels. But if they're at high levels already, it doesn't really kill those organisms and knock them down. And so that actually feeding an ionophore is an important part of the control mechanism or strategy for this operation. So early on, there's a couple of other products, so dicoquinate or amprolium, which will do a better job of killing those organisms at other stages of the life cycle. And a lot of times when we first wean calves, and the risk of coccidiosis is the greatest. We've got weather stress, we've got weaning stress. We're bringing calves from multiple areas, even if it's the same ranch, bringing them together. A lot of times what we recommend is feeding, one of those two drugs that will kill those organisms and knock the levels down. And then once we've kind of gotten through that period, then they start on their ionophores.
Now, do you have to, if this operation, so we confirm coccidia took care of it, do they have to worry about it next year? Is it going to come back? Is it going to stay in that environment? Say you've got a scenario, you've got your dry lot and you use it for weaned calves and then it sits for a season.
Yeah. Well, I'm not really worried about the coccidia overwintering and oversummering in the same place, but the situation that set up the problem this year sure may show up again next year.
Same cattle, same
pasture, maybe even the same drainage, that I'm prone to some muddy lots, environment, those type of things. So a lot of times the situation stays the same, even though the coccidia are brought in by the next group of cattle.
Once again, that was the Beef Cattle Institute's Bob Larson and Brad White. You can hear the full conversation by going to ksubci.org. The rest of the podcast episode will also be linked in today's show notes on agtoday.net. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but we'll be right back.
Welcome back, and thanks for joining us on Agriculture Today. Along with Shelby Varner, I'm Jeff Wickman. We end today's program with this week's milk lines. As winter rapidly approaches, dairy producers should be ready to provide added protection against teat damage caused by extremely cold weather. K-State dairy specialist Mike Brouk explains the various treatments available and at what point additional protection is warranted.
Today I'd like to visit with our Kansas dairy producers concerning somatic cell counts as we head into the winter season. Across our dairies here in the central milk marketing orders, we have made great progress in reducing somatic cell count across the year. And in fact, in 2024, we saw a lower than normal average somatic cell count across the marketing area, which is a really good sign for our industry. We do a lot to try to reduce the incidence of mastitis and control it in our dairy herd. And generally in the fall of the year, we see some of the lowest counts during the whole year. However, as we approach the first of the year and get into the months of January and February, we generally see an increase in somatic cell count amongst our herds. However, the increase is not alarming. It's just an increase that we see. So I wanted to visit just a little bit about why we're seeing that in those winter months. A lot of this has to do with actually the teat-in condition in your dairy herd. So as we go into the winter months, we're more susceptible to seeing rough teat-ins. And when we look at teat end scores and we look at how rough those teat ends are, that generally has an impact on the amount of bacteria that's held close to the teat end, and thus we see an increase in somatic cell count and probably are going to see an increase in the incidences of clinical mastitis within our animals as well. How rough those teat ends get, well, that depends on a lot of issues. One is just exposure to the cold weather, and I know many of you probably adapt some different teat dipping mechanisms when the weather gets extremely cold, and we sometimes use different products to try to lessen the chances that we'll see rough teat ends, and that does help control the somatic cell count and reduce the incidences of clinical mastitis in our herd when we do that. So when do you need to really be concerned about conditions that might cause an increase in rough teat ends? Well, generally what we say is if the wind chill and temperature are going to result in something that's greater than minus 25, we're at fairly extreme risk for freezing of the teat dip on the ends of the teats as the cows exit the milking parlor. So there's a lot of different management things that you can do. Number one, need to look at a winterized teat dip under those sorts of conditions that will not freeze or is much slower to freeze than our normal teat dips. Sometimes we go to a dry product as well. There are several excellent powders out there that contain both conditioners for the teat end as well as something that will take care of bacteria issues as well. So it does provide protection. The other things that we can think about doing during the winter time is we can make sure that we have windbreaks so that when cattle exit the milking parlor, they're not exposed to the extremely cold wind. So building those windbreaks out of straw bales or other material that we might have around the dairy. Just keep in mind that when we use something like straw bales, there is the risk of drifting snow, so making sure that we have those bales piled far enough away so the snow does not fall into the walkway of the cattle is very important in preventing drifting snow from being a concern. The other thing to think about, particularly for those animals that are just prior to calving in your transition pens, making sure that we have plenty of bedding. This is Mike Brouk with K-State Research and Extension, encouraging our dairy farmers to prepare for freezing temperatures and make sure that they have a winter teat dipping program in place and supplies on hand to carry that out.
Thanks, Mike. And that'll do it for this edition of Agriculture Today. For Shelby Varner, I'm Jeff Wickman. This is the K-State Radio Network.